Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Have you ever woken up to a crisis because a number on a dashboard is broken and no one knows why, or sent out frustrating Slack messages trying to find the right dataset, or tried to understand what a column name means? Our friends at Atlan started out as a data team themselves and faced all this collaboration chaos. They started building Atlan as an internal tool for themselves. Atlan is a collaborative workspace for data-driven teams, like GitHub for engineering or Figma for design teams. By acting as a virtual hub for data assets ranging from tables and dashboards to SQL snippets and code, Atlan enables teams to create a single source of truth for all of their data assets, and collaborate across the modern data stack through deep integrations with tools like Snowflake, Slack, Looker, and more. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Atlan today, that's ATLAN, and sign up for a free trial. If you're a Data Engineering Podcast listener, you get credits worth $3,000 on an annual subscription. When you're ready to build your next pipeline and want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows, or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today, that's LINODE, and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Your host is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Matthew Halliday about Incorta, an in-memory unified data and analytics platform as a service. So Matthew, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Tobias. So my name is Matthew Halliday. I'm one of the co-founders of Incorta. I'm responsible for product marketing at Incorta, which has been a journey now for about 8 years. And prior to that, I spent my time at Oracle and Microsoft. So been around the data space for quite some time, working with various enterprise applications and providing value from data, analytics from data, and helping businesses try to solve complex and difficult problems. So at Incorta, we really birthed the company out of this vision that there was a fundamental underlying problem that nobody was addressing in reality. And it was, before you could do anything with analytics, you had to start with dimensional models. You had to go through this kind of heavy processing. And we just wanted to challenge that. If there's a better way, could we do analytics on the data in its original form or shape and be able to do that more effectively and efficiently so we could deliver faster time to insight? So we're all about providing customers, users, people who want to ask questions of data to do that in a very timely, fast fashion, not months and years, to be able to shorten that time down and then be able to provide data in a way that helps them make informed decisions. That's really what we're all about.
And do you remember how you first got started working in the data space?
Computer science graduate. I joined Oracle and started working on databases, working with applications, building data. Very quickly started to realize that I had fascination with learning from data and tracking events and things. So the first thing I built was like an application that just tracked environment usage, like what was going on with environments. And there was about 100 database environments that I was responsible for at the time, and who was logging into what, how often, and all those kind of things. So I started tracking all of this behavior around these environments. And this was back in the 90s, late 90s. And so kind of got into that. And ever since then, I've always been fascinated about data, to the point that I was one of the early adopters of like heart rate monitors when it was just Polar doing the thing before it became all the smart devices that we have now. And used to use that to go, training, working out, and then analyzing all my data and looking at how to be a better athlete from all the data that I was acquiring. So always had this fascination and interest with how data can help me be more effective and efficient in my job. And, that kind of rolls into other areas as well. So kind of always had that kind of role around big data applications. Worked on some of the, the largest Oracle accounts with some of the largest data volumes they were producing there, and helping, customers be able to leverage that data for themselves as well.
And you mentioned a bit about the story behind what motivated you to build Incorta. I'm wondering if you can give some detail about what it is that you're creating there.
As I mentioned earlier, right, everyone starts with the same data set, right? You have an application, you have a source system. And there's data residing in a data model that was intentionally built in the data model the way it is. And we refer to this as third normalization form, 3NF, or relational data sets. And that's where you might have something like an order, right? An order for a product. And you would have actually probably, you can imagine the screen, right? You can imagine, I have who's the customer, the address, the bill to location, the ship to location, what is contained within the order, if there's shipping lines, tax lines, all of this kind of information, you could imagine it on the screen in front of you. In reality, behind the scenes, though, is probably 30 to 40 tables that are being used to generate that one order that you're looking at. And that process of pulling it together, we all know, if you've been around, a while, remember the days when you have to call up and, kind of ask for a status on an order. And invariably the person, would ask for your order ID or order number, and then they would say, oh, my system's a little slow today, as they would wait 5, 10, 15 seconds to bring up your one order. The reason it took that long is because it was stitching together and doing joins across these tables. And that becomes the most difficult, complex thing you can ask a database to do. It's actually so inefficient that the way that it happens is what we refer to as order n log n, which is exponential in terms of as you add joins. So if you're looking at one record, you kind of can get through it because it's like one joining to another to another. The times when you then say, I want to look across all my transactions, well, now you're taking that 10, 15 seconds and multiplying it by all of your transactions, and it becomes, an unwielding beast. So that was kind of the world that we all start with and the applications we have. And the problems with those is that they don't lend themselves to analytics. And there's reasons why we create 40 tables behind the scenes so that we can do things like you can update the bill to location while someone else is, shipping an order. You don't want those things to kind of be all over the map and causing issues there for people. So that's where some of the reasons we have these. Now, the problem comes when you want to do analytics. When you look at that, you can't run queries that take 23 hours to run, which is not uncommon to see queries just running against this 3NF model, taking days and then failing. That's kind of the world you live in. So it's like, okay, how do we fix that? So conventional wisdom, since even back to the 80s and 90s, it was funny. I was in the office the other day and I saw a magazine that was from 1995, and it was saying this might be the year of the data warehouse. An article that was written by Rain Eckerson about this very topic of how to do analytics. And it was all around, you've got to change the shape of the data and you've got to put it into a dimensional model. And when you put things in dimensional models, you're really changing the whole shape of the data set. Now that process becomes very expensive. Changing and moving the data, transforming it, creating surrogate keys and joins, all of those things that go into creating a dimensional star schema model really become restrictive. And you have all these different models, but they're not connected as well. So you get very isolated analytics. So, I think Oracle had the database, it has Java, it has Sun Microsystems, it has analytical applications, it has the applications. Had the R&D team actually responsible for the deployment of Oracle at Oracle, and yet at the end of a quarter, what would you see? You would see, when we were there, spreadsheets being handed around. There would be, here's all the deals that closed. And so that's where, people were working with. And in reality, that process is just takes too long. Normally, you can only do it, once or 2 or 3 times a day in terms of refresh rates. And because it's going through that transformation as a model that really is built for the query that you want to ask. What's the question you want to ask? And I start with building a data model to answer that question. So when a lot of people think about, performance tuning or like, how do I make my queries faster? They think I got to make the query more efficient. I got to write better SQL. Well, in reality, most of the time when we would do performance tuning at Oracle and Microsoft, what we would actually do is change the data model. We would look at it. It's not always changing the SQL statement. It's like, how can I eliminate some joins? Do I need to denormalize some of this data down because I'm going to cross a join just to get one field? That's kind of very inefficient. So you do all of these things, but the problem is that becomes highly restrictive. So we thought, okay, what if we focused on that rather than just, looking at creating another tech stack and another, each set of ETL tools? What if we could say, let's work out how to make a query engine that's specifically built for the relational data set, the data set that you find in your operational analytics, the ERP systems, the CRM systems, the supply chain systems. How do we bring all of those things together? So that's really what Incorta set out to address. And we did that. We created a query engine where instead of it being exponential when it does these types of joins that are very prevalent in 3NF, it actually does them order n. So it makes it feel like there's really no overhead. So we have customers running with billions of records on 40 table joins. And it's not table joins from like a large data set to a very small data set. We're talking about billions of rows joining to billions of rows, joining to hundreds of millions of rows, joining to more hundreds of millions of rows. And as it kind of goes on like that, a lot of people would do this with like, yes, we can process petabytes of data and even join it as long as the join tables are very small and can be replicated across all of the nodes, right? So that's exactly, what people kind of been doing and thinking, but that requires you to change the structure because that's not what your source data looks like. That's not what you start with. So that's kind of exactly what we've kind of got into and focused on and building solutions for that business problem. Like, how do we make that work? And that's where we hit on something. We figured out a way to make it work. And then the benefits are, well, now we're doing data analytics on the kind of duplicate digital twin of your source application. So it's almost like equivalent to doing like maybe bronze or silver equivalent, where you don't have to go to a dimensional model. You can do the analytics on top. You can run these queries and get sub-second responses. You can change the queries very easily. Everything is metadata driven. It's not creating data transformations behind the scenes or cubes or materialized views or caching in some kind of creative way to anticipate what you're doing. It literally is just running those queries as you ask them, and yet you're getting those responses. So that's kind of the genesis of the idea and where we went with the product.
And as far as the sort of technological underpinnings of being able to manage these digital twins of your source data without having to do all of this upfront work to extract it, load it, transform it, model it before you can actually write the query, I'm wondering if you can talk to just the overall system design and architecture and some of the new engineering that you had to do to be able to build out this query engine to support this workflow that is, I haven't come across in any of the other conversations I've had for this specific approach to how to manage the data workflow.
There's a few things that happened, right? So one of the first things is you look at a relational model and the data is optimized to be a record level writes, right? So when you do that, it's great because you're reading all the information because you're rendering it all on a screen. With columnar, that's the first step, right? You have to adopt column structure because that really helps with the way we do analytics. We generally look at all of your measure, like for revenue against all of another dimensional value. And we're not really interested in any other value apart from those two pieces at that point. So being able to store your data in a columnar format is very appropriate and makes a lot of sense. So of course, we're not the first people to do that at all. And a lot of people have been doing that, but it just makes sense that that's kind of the new standard. So leveraging file formats like Parquet file format, that's how we store our data set. Then on top of that, there's what do we do with memory processing? When I started out at Oracle in 97, I think 1 gig of DRAM would set you back about $20,000. When you look at how that changed, when MapReduce came out, it was down to about $400 in 2004. If you look at the genesis of Incorta back in 2013, 2014, that was down to like $5 for 1 gig of DRAM. And now it's less than $1, right? It's about 70 cents, roundabout. That change is like you architect and build things differently when the constraints have changed. And so it was all about how to optimize for disk. That was one thing. But now it's like, okay, now we have memory footprints that we couldn't even imagine. So now your whole entire queries can oftentimes just reside in memory, right? The entire data that you're going to do is going to be memory data processing. So how do you leverage data? And so really, when you think about memory, there's multiple levels to that memory conversation. So we looked at how can we best leverage L1 cache versus L2 versus L3, because it's the fastest memory that you have in a CPU. How do we make sure that we don't go through the bus, which is slow, to go to the memory? When we bring something into memory and we're transacting on it, how do we make sure that it's faster and it actually is more effective? Well, our L1 hit ratios are significantly higher. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we keep the data compressed. So we actually do analytics on compressed data. We're not talking about compression of data just on disk for storage and then uncompress into memory. We keep it compressed. So we do analytics on compressed data. And then also, because we keep it in its original form, there is a correlation between what you're reading for the next piece of the query is probably already there because these things haven't been rebuilt because they're in the natural way that they were created. So when you do that, what ends up happening is you get this much faster response. So leveraging things like that, leveraging the memory footprint in a kind of unique way as some of the technologies we're able to take, that gets us so far. And so we looked at like 50 database papers around how do people do joins? How do people join table A to table B and just table C to get to G? And every single one of those white papers, all 50 of them, had exactly the same way of doing it. It's a hash table function that's order n log n, exponential, takes a lot of time, and makes it the most punishing operation you can ask a database to do, is to join two data sets together, right? So that's where we went out. So we built an algorithm, or hash table join function, that does that in a much more effective and efficient way. Now, there's other things that are going on in the market that you need to be aware of, right? So what we saw is also, with memory processing and Spark coming into play, it's like, okay, how can we leverage Spark? So there's Spark within our platform as well, which can help with, taking what would have been PL SQL functions in an Oracle database and being able to use those, or even using kind of value add transformations. So when I talk about transformations, I largely put them into two buckets. One would be a transformation that brings value to the data. It improves the data in the sense of it makes it more valuable. And then the second one is it transforms the data in order to do performance tuning to make a SQL query kind of come back with an answer, right? That's the dimensional modeling and transform kind of piece on that side. So, we kind of look at how can we do this in a much more effective way. And so we have that capability using Spark. And so we've seen really creative ways in how we can use Spark within the platform as well. And so even roles like companies now doing fixed asset depreciation, which is normally a very intensive ERP, PL SQL, EBS kind of intensive task, moving that out into PySpark and running it there, and then using these heavy, expensive queries that would have been on an Oracle database, run those on Incorta, get your depreciation of your assets, and then being able to push them back. So we see some of those technologies. There's some of the technologies that show a lot of promise, but don't work for these types of challenges too. That's the other thing that I think people need to be aware of, is that there isn't one data platform that suits everything. We have a number of customers, one in kind of the media, a couple in the media streaming business, and one of the largest like social media site. And they have digital data platforms that can process hundreds of petabytes of data. And whether it's impressions, click information, all those kind of things. And they do it really effectively. And that's generally how people think about these technologies, right? It's like, hey, we put this great technology together, whether you're using Presto or some kind of technology like that. But in reality, if you throw 56 gigs of an ERP 3NF data model at it and ask it to run, it won't be effective and it won't work. Sometimes people think, how big is this data set? That's not the question. It's what is the data structure? Like, you need to understand that. If it's a single table, it could be 300 petabytes and you can slice it up, farm it across lots of nodes, bring back your results and get really, really good performance. And there's a lot of data problems and challenges where that's perfect. That's the right solution. But knowing that how the other solutions or certain other applications that you deal with do need a different approach. Now, the thing that I think is interesting is how do you bring these things together? How do we bring an environment where you're not a company that says, hey, we have 300 petabytes of data that we can process, but we still have to have this 1980s, 90s technology for running our data warehouse. And sure, we might have modernized it by putting some aspects on the cloud, but in reality, it's still the same data transformation, data modeling that we've been doing for the last 30 years plus. So we look at how do we bring these two together? And so within Incorta platform, it's leveraging things like Parquet, having things like Spark, PySpark, Scala available within the platform, looking at those open standards. So you can start to do predictive analysis and various other things, but bring all of the business users around the data onto a single platform, but be open to all those other things, because I think there's a lot of specific solutions to specific problems that people encounter. So having things like Delta Lake format, or looking at Parquet, or if you're looking at like iceberg tables, those things make it a lot easier for the data to be transported between different solutions to provide that. So I think there's a lot of things going on in this industry, and especially in the last 5 to 6 years, where this has sped up quite significantly in terms of how we engage with data and how data is actually even delivered to us as well.
As you have been going on this journey of building this system and working with your customers on it and trying to keep it up to date with all of the rapid evolution that's been happening in the surrounding ecosystem. What are some of the ways that the overall design and goals of the platform have changed or evolved in that time?
Yeah, so I mentioned Parquet. When we started out, we weren't using Parquet, right? So, 8 years ago, we had our own format. We moved off of that a few years into our journey and went that way. I think the other thing that we're starting to see now is, the rise of the table formats, right? So there's a file format, but now there's a table format. And you can think of this as really being, how do we create the disk or the cloud storage layers to feel like the equivalent of your DBF files in Oracle? Really in an open standard way that you can drop in any application on top, any query acceleration engine on top, whether that's Incorta or someone else, to be able to run against that data. So I think that definitely seen that shift and change in trying to move towards that. I think there's been also a big shift in people moving away from just doing things in traditional kind of ETL tools to actually exploring a lot now in terms of what can they do with things like PySpark, whether that's pushing loads back into query engines to create these transformations, but value add in that, been some changes there. The other bit I would say is we've definitely seen a shift in where the focus has been in terms of companies. A few years back, we're all about we're a Tableau shop or we're a Power BI shop, and that's our standard. I think what we're starting to see now is that the people are realizing the visualization is kind of the last, and it's almost like saying, "Oh, we're an Outlook, company." It's like, so what happens if I have an iPhone and I just want to use Mac Mail? Like, I can't use it? No, we just use Outlook. It's like people want to consume data the way that they want to consume it in the formats and the variety of formats that they want. So that really isn't the problem, right? We should be open to any viz, I would say, being able to connect and to represent it how that user wants to look at it. Conversation now has definitely moved away from that, where we're not hearing that so much anymore. Sometimes you get it and people just ask, "Oh, we use Power BI. Like, do you have that as a connector?" And, of course, yes, we do. But the conversation now is more around, how do I get data in the hands of my business users to solve their day-to-day business challenge problems at the speed of which things are changing? So that's been kind of a bit of a shift, where it's not about the finished product on a known set of questions. It's more about, how do I handle the unknown? And I think, of course, prior to even the pandemic, that started with the China tariff crisis that started, and there's a whole bunch of you'd have products on a ship in the ocean, and you're like, if this lands, in a harbor and I can get it off a boat this today instead of tomorrow, there's going to be different, taxes and tariffs imposed. What does that mean? What does that mean for my product profitability? Do I need to change the products? Pricing, can I absorb it? All of these questions started coming. And of course, then in the pandemic, and now with supply chain and just all the challenges that we're seeing, people are now realizing more than ever that, data wasn't just a scorecard. Data shouldn't be the thing that I do my kind of Monday morning quarterback and just, evaluate how did people do. Really, data, to be effective within a company, is in the moment when the decision's being made. How do I make a better decision because of the data that's informing and helping me, that's alerting me to blind spots that I might have, versus you using data to assess, did I do a good job, right? That's really demoralizing, because you're like, well, I did the best that I knew with what I knew in the circumstance. But if I had had access to the data that you had after the event, of course I wouldn't have made this decision. I would have made a very completely different decision. Or if I had the freedom to ask those more questions, to be able to change, to handle what-if scenarios, to play out different, use cases or different scenario planning, all of those things become really, really important. And that's where the conversation started to go. And so now, we're starting to see the rise of this in a few different ways, I would say. One is people are starting to talk about micro-batch ETL, things like that, or reverse ETL, like how do I get back to the action and the statement to actually do an action? Because at the end of the day, just looking at a dashboard, if that's all I do, that's just expensive artwork, right? If there's not actually a decision that's been made, you're probably better off not spending all that money on the digital data pipeline that you have and the dashboards that you have. Go buy some real artwork and motivate, your employees and have them look at that. It'd probably be better. But if you can actually get to a decision and what are the buttons that they can press and pull, how do I help them make the better decision? That's the key thing, because that's when data proves its value. So One of the things that you kind of look at as well in this space is this like, for all the talk of being data driven, it's such a nebulous term, right? What does data driven mean? And how do I know if we're data driven? Does that mean we used data in our executive meeting last week? Someone brought up a spreadsheet and it looked pretty, impressive and nobody could challenge it. And so we went with the decision. I think, no, that's not being data driven. I think there's markers that characteristics of companies that are truly data driven that start to look like. So one of our customers, Broadcom, they used to run 400 queries a day. And they were sending out reports, and their business users were taking those reports on a daily basis. You can imagine they go in their email, they get a report, they look at it, and then they go and do their job. Once they got Incorta, though, there's certain things that changed. All of a sudden, they went from running 400 queries a day to 70,000 queries per day. I'm like, okay, that's a shift and a change in the way people are working and the way people are thinking about data. That's an indicator to me of like there's penetration into that organization, that people are beginning now to start to see data in a different way. Well, why is that? Why are more queries being run? Well, one of the things they said, it used to take them 12 to 18 weeks to even just add a single dimensional value. So if you say, hey, I've got this star schema, it's great, I'm looking at this, it goes so far, but I want to bring in this new value, this new dimension. I want to look at this revenue by fill in the blank, right? No one knows what it's going to be. This week could be different than last week. They turned that around to being like less than a 5-minute exercise for them. So it's like, oh, you want that? Drag, drop, here's your report, done. Again, that just keeps people in that flow of when they're making decisions, when they're being informed. That's the expectation. That's what we've got to get to, so the data feels empowering and not like it's the thing that is almost like my quarterly business review that's used against me to show me how terrible a job I'm doing or how great of a job I'm doing, but really isn't helping me do a better job. So those are some of the things that I see in terms of the shift and the changes. Of course, there's a lot of different technologies coming into the marketplace around that. But I think the question that people have to keep looking at and asking is like, are those things what we're driving to? Because technology can be interesting and it can be like a puzzle. Like, hey, I got this thing to work together, wonderful. But in reality, it's what's the value you're providing? What are the projects and how did they change the business?
Absolutely. And in terms of the sort of personas and use cases that you're focused on, I'm wondering if you can describe the sort of intentionality that you're using to determine what are the core capabilities that we want to bake into Incorta, what are the pieces that we want to allow for extension and integration with other systems, and how does that inform the way that Incorta sits in the different workflows of the various personas throughout the organization?
We've had a lot of success with people who are responsible for the applications. They're in IT and they're kind of responsible for the reporting, the analytics on top of those applications, not necessarily always in the kind of the central analytic team for some of the enterprises. And what we found there is that when you look at that persona, they understand their application, they understand the business use case really, really well. And so we've had a lot of feedback from those individuals on what the challenges they're trying to achieve and do. And so we've built solutions specifically to help in those areas. So that's, one of the reasons why recently we were announced by Gartner as a niche provider within their Magic Quadrant, which, is very competitive to get into. There's, 20 companies that make it in. So you have to knock someone out in order to get into those spots. But really focused on those use cases, we've been able to bring, a lot of value. Now, when there's times where you get off, those use cases, and you want to start to look at other things, it's like, well, how do we integrate and play with those? So for us, it's looking at, where's the value we provide, the uniqueness that we provide. So for example, once you land data in Parquet, it's great because it makes it accessible to a whole bunch of other applications. So we have customers with integrations with like Data IQ, where they come in and say, hey, I want to go and do some data flow processing here and then push the data back to Incorta and then leverage it. We have customers that have Snowflake and use that as like an archive layer where everything sits, but then they use for the performance acceleration, they're using Incorta to do those queries on top. So there's ways in which we can create environments where those things work. So one of the interesting partnerships we've done recently is with Microsoft. And so Microsoft realized that, Incorta really understands this ERP ecosystem very, very well and is able to take Oracle EBS or Oracle SAP customers and provide data that can be leveraged and used within Synapse. But customers were struggling to get and make meaningful sense of that data, to get it out of those systems and then to get it into a shape and a format. And so using Incorta and our query engine, we can actually create, whether it's a dashboard or a data set that can then be leveraged by another application, such as Synapse, that can be used to then power and help them, however they want to use that data moving forward. So we've definitely seen that people come in and start their journey from different places. Some of our customers, in the mid-market segment, oftentimes come in and say, this is great. You've got connectors for NetSuite. A customer came into our product last month. Within 19 days, they came in on day one. They signed up for an Incorta trial. They then connected to their NetSuite data. On day 2 and 3, they were looking at their NetSuite data and then building out their own custom dashboards. And then within 19 days, they were an Incorta customer and they'd already moved forward because everything they wanted was contained within that. Then, of course, on the other side, you have enterprise customers, some of the largest brands, Fortune 100 companies in the world, where they want to know, how do you tie into the other systems investments we've made? And that's where that kind of open architecture, which is, I think, become very common now across a lot of the more modern vendors that are in the marketplace, where we're realizing that, yes, it's not us or it's us and are better together, right? It's like, how do you leverage these components and do what they do best, right? So Incorta does 3NF data models very, very efficiently. I don't see anything in the market that comes close to what we can do that. But if you were to come in and say, Matthew, I've got a bunch of log files that are coming off my web servers, I'm not going to say, hey, you should be throwing those into Incorta. You might be thinking, oh, I might use Splunk for that. Or if you come in and say, I've got some click data that's coming in off of, behavior, IoT sensors and devices, you might think, Presto is a great application for that, just given the volumes and the things that you're looking at. So I think it's really being able to realize that data is different. Data has different qualities about it and extensible that can help bring all of the business cases that you're trying to solve and bring that together in a way that kind of gives you the best result. Now, the challenges I have been seeing, quite honestly, is that oftentimes in that particular space, the integrations are more complex than they should be. So a lot of vendors, they have integrations, but they're very heavy on the code side. And so one of the things we've focused on is how do we make low code, no code integrations across the board? So how do we have it so that you don't have to come in and do a whole bunch of heavy coding to get some of these tasks? And in many respects, I always think these are very menial tasks. They're not high value. We want the people who are doing data engineering to do the high value tasks. The more you do that, the more you shine, the more of a hero you become. If you're spending all your time just kind of like, hey, I've got to just peel potatoes because I need a lot of potatoes, like that's probably not the magic of what you can produce as a chef. It's like, what can you then do, whether you're creating gnocchi, or whether you're doing something else with them? That's when you can really elevate it. So it's like, spend more time doing that, less time just doing this grunt work. So we've spent a lot of time and focus on those partnerships of like how to make that more effective and reduce a lot of the coding aspects that are in there that really don't scale, because it's not like you have one data pipeline. You probably have thousands of them. And then if you have to do that and maintain them, you get to a certain point where all you're doing is keeping the lights on. And that's super frustrating when you can't meet the demands of your customers and the new requirements coming in. We know so little of the business data is actually being analyzed. Some estimates are anywhere from like 10 to 20% of business data actually gets analyzed. And part of it is because the cost of it has just been so much, you have to prioritize what's the data that's most important. But when you can start to reduce that threshold or that cost of query significantly and the amount of effort it takes to answer a question, all of a sudden that data becomes a lot more accessible and much more interesting. So more opportunities come as a result.
Are you struggling with broken pipelines, stale dashboards, missing data? If this resonates with you, you're not alone. Data engineers struggling with unreliable data need look no further than Monte Carlo, the leading end-to-end data observability platform. Trusted by the teams at Fox, JetBlue, and PagerDuty, Monte Carlo solves the costly problem of broken data pipelines. Monte Carlo monitors and alerts for data issues across your data warehouses, data lakes, dbt models, Airflow jobs, and business intelligence tools, reducing time to detection and resolution from weeks to just minutes. Monte Carlo also gives you a holistic picture of data health with automatic end-to-end lineage from ingestion to the BI layer directly out of the box. Start trusting your data with Monte Carlo today. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Monte Carlo to learn more. One of the things that you've gone back to a few times is the idea of dimensional modeling and third normal form in the source systems and how you're able to explore your data more quickly and more effectively. And I'm wondering if you can talk to some of the ways that the usage of Incorta and the capabilities that it provides influences the ways that teams think about the data modeling aspect and how they want to land that source data into their analytical systems for being able to, ask and answer questions about it.
Ultimately, the way people start to think about this is you think more in terms of the availability of the data that you have, the possibilities of what you can answer, and then how do you roll those out in more self-service ways. So a lot of what our customers have been focusing on is rather than being the person that creates the report for that individual, have that data in the platform and then provide a semantic layer on top of that. Because here's one of the things, right? I would never want to put a 3NF model in front of a data analyst. Here you go, build your Tableau dashboard on top of this. It's intimidating. It's huge. Now, everyone starts with that same model, but it's like, who actually gets to interface with it? Traditionally in a star schema, what has been nice about it, a simple model when you look at it. You have a fact table and you have some dimensions and it's quite simple and straightforward to use comparatively. So what we've said is like bring that down though into a layer, into a semantic layer, which is all metadata driven. And that's the beautiful thing about it is you can create almost like unlimited virtual stars that can be connected with each other within a semantic layer as a metadata, not as a physical implementation of that data. That's where it becomes problematic because you have to write a whole bunch of data pipeline code to make that happen. So when our customers view this, the way that they've started to think about it is, how do I create these business schemas, the semantic layer that I can put out and then have my users build whatever they want? So we have applications that customers have used, like Shutterfly, for example. They had Oracle EBS and they recently just moved to SAP and they did exactly the same thing for SAP where they took out all of their supply chain planning, their inventory, payables, purchasing, and brought all of that data together so they could have clear insight into exactly where they stood at any point in time with their inventory levels, stock levels, days on hand. Now, what they did for their business users is we put these semantic layer in place. They didn't use any of the sample dashboards. They literally just used the sample dashboards to gain understanding, education, if you like, right? To figure out, okay, this is how it all puts together, this is how it works. Those business users actually built their own dashboards. Because they had invested the time in creating this semantic layer, they were able to build it themselves and ended up building like 30 dashboards that enabled them to run and see everything within their business. Ended up reducing stockouts from like 77 down to 7 over a course year over year by being able to do that. That's kind of where you see the investment. It's like how to get people to feel like they can be self-serve, that they have access to a lot of possibilities, that if they have new dimensions they want to get access to, it's a simple request. It's not something that's like, okay, back to the drawing board. We're going to have to tear down this, this star schema and rebuild it. Those things are just never going to scale. That's the problem. Like you can get a star schema to do things, but you can never scale star schemas at the speed that the business needs to move, or the amount of data that your organization's generating. Like those things will never work. And also they can never be real time enough. Like by definition, you're replicating the data and then you're putting it through a bunch of transformations. You can throw more hardware at it. You can throw processing at it like crazy. It's much more efficient if you can just run directly against it and you don't have to do those kind of changes in work. So that's kind of been a lot of the thought is just around how to leverage the data in a more meaningful way for the business, how to put it in front of them in a way that they can consume, that you don't have to be the gatekeepers all the time. And yet you still have things like controls, you still want governance, you still want security, you want to make sure that people are only having access to what they have, you want to be able to manage it, see which dashboards are being used, what's the query performance over time, what's the data volumes going in and out over time, having the visibility into managing all those things so that the service isn't disrupted, that people get access to what they need and can have all of that. So it becomes like a different focus, which actually feels very empowering for the people who are the consumers and gets people out of just doing a lot of, very busy work or frustrating work because, traditionally, when I spoke to a lot of data engineers and analysts, they were pretty frustrated because everyone was unhappy with them because everybody wants more than they can produce. So they have a lot of unhappy customers. And it's not because they're not sharp. It's not because they're not smart. It's just because there's no way that they could get, the teams to be the size they would have to be able to satisfy everything that people would need. So yeah, it become very challenging. So this is where a lot of, our customers are saying that this is very like freeing, where they can now start to go and do some more creative work and look into other areas of the business as well. So what we've seen is a shift of data engineers taking on a little bit of some data science roles. No always like, hardcore data science, but starting to use some of the same things, same technologies, using Python, using, pandas, using, maybe a gradient tree to look at some kind of, different kind of ways of looking at the data, looking at, how to surface different pieces of that data that might be of interest to the business as well.
And to that point of the fact that Incorta frees up some of the time of these different roles and the work that they're trying to do because they don't have to do as much heavy lifting to be able to empower different members of the business. I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the different collaboration capabilities that Incorta provides for being able to either bridge across these different roles or allow these roles to overlap more.
Bringing your business users, your data engineers, your data science onto one platform where they all use the same data, I think has been really, really compelling and interesting, because really at the end of the day, you want people to be using the same data, the same definition of data. You don't want your data scientists to have a different definition of what revenue means than the business is looking at. And so in Incorta, one is bringing things like notebook experiences into the platform, as well as dashboarding capabilities, as well as having this semantic layer, which you can leverage anything, whether it's Excel, Power BI, Tableau on top of those things, has been very effective in kind of bringing people together on that. It's also because everyone's using the same data with the same refresh rates and recycle refresh rates, it becomes very easy for them to understand exactly what is going on in terms of the data and the way that they interact with it. And so in the Incorta platform, we've made it easy because you can control what people can access. So for example, I can create a business set of rules that if business users are coming into a dashboard, maybe they can only see transactions that are specific to their region. Maybe you're a West Coast sales manager. You should only see your West Coast accounts. However, if you're doing data science, you might need to look at everything, but you don't need to see all of the columns. Like some of the things you don't need to be looking at, or you need to mask the data or encrypt the data so that you don't actually see the values behind it. But you just want to get ultimately, is it a 0 or 1, right? You change strings and various things into just a classification. So you want to be able to classify the data. You don't necessarily need to have access to everything. So being able to set up those kind of rules within the platform, also even hierarchies, when you think about hierarchies and the way you traverse those, being able to ensure that, you can look at salary information, but maybe you can only look at an aggregate level. You can't go all the way down, but then other people might have access to an aggregate level of that information. So having that within one platform where you set those sets of rules and you can have different policies and rules on the data, and yet everyone then can look at it and leverage it. And then once a data scientist is done with some data, they can share it just with a couple of clicks, just like you would share maybe like a Google Doc or something with somebody. You can do exactly the same thing within the platform. So it becomes very easy for people to collaborate around the data to leverage the same things so that you don't have to build it multiple times. So oftentimes you'll see business analysts working on a data warehouse, and then you say the data scientist people are working on the data lake. And those things are completely separate, and they've got different pipelines to the two of them, and they probably end up, with code issues between them. So you get different results, and then you've got to figure out whose number's correct. All of those challenges start to come into play. When you bring everything together and you're kind of consolidated on that, one platform or one approach for the platform, if you want to think of it that way. When I say one platform, I mean everything's in Parquet. You have the same semantic layer. You have the same business rules being applied. You have the query engines. Query engines could be different. You might be using Spark SQL. You might be using Incorta's analytical engine for the 3NF queries. You might be using Spark and using an Incorta query to help create a data frame that you're then going to leverage and use. So you could be using a business schema. So as a data scientist, I might say, I'm going to look at this business schema that was created for these business users and do some analysis work on it. So being able to use that same data set, be able to share the data, collaborate around the same definition of the data makes a lot of sense. And I think there's a lot of value in doing that rather than just kind of doing the same, in essence, work again, but in a different tool sets for different outcomes.
And in terms of the ways that you have seen teams and organizations using Incorta, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected applications that you have seen?
Yeah, so I've seen a lot recently, and I don't know if this might be just something that kind of came out the pandemic and what was going on in the pandemic. I know I heard a lot of organizations trying to look at product profitability and figure out which products should we prioritize. So, some companies cut down their product lines because they really wanted to put out the ones that they were, one, most associated with their brand that you would expect and want to see when you go there, and then two, generate the most revenues. So even prior to that, there's a coffee distributor that we work with, a global coffee distributor that many years ago started off with product profitability, wanted to drill down to 20,000 plus store locations and look at every piece of the SKUs that they have by day. Like oftentimes it's amazing the abstraction level of detail that customers are generally used to having. As another kind of big technology box company that sells, a lot of the technology products that you know and love and buy. And they had a similar thing where they would know things like, we know that the computer segment for this month did well. But they couldn't tell you if that's because they were selling more Ethernet cables, more services, or MacBook Pros. It was fascinating. And they couldn't even pinpoint it down to a single store location on a single day and say, wow, we had 100 MacBooks sold in this one store on this one day. They wouldn't know that level of insight. So we've seen those cases really kind of ratchet up. I think that makes sense. So is it surprising? No, there's huge value there. So I see a lot of that, and I think it's very effective. Some of the ways that I think have surprised me was this coffee distributor. They have like loyalty cards, right? So you go to a store, you use your loyalty card, and you have some money left on it, and you can start to use it. So there's this accounting policy called breakage. Value card breakage. And what it means is this: when you sell a gift card for like, let's say $20, and if someone hasn't used it, you can't recognize that as revenue until they start to use it, because in essence, you're carrying a liability because they haven't rendered the service. They've just have a commit, right? It's commit credits. It's not, in essence, something that you can burn down. Now, there are some certain rules, though. Over a certain period of time, you can start to recognize it as revenue. They realize that it's unrealistic to think that if there's a card that has 25 cents on it that was used in earnest for 6 months and then disappeared for 6 years, that someone's going to show up one day with this and say, hey, I want my discount on my coffee. I've got this card. So, this coffee distributor actually holds more money on these value cards than a lot of banks do in liquidity. So they have huge volumes of money. And we're talking about being able to recognize additional like 50 million in revenue, because they were actually able to look at not just 12 months of data, because you can think about every single swipe and every single rule that applies into this, with like 30 billion plus transactions on these stored value cards. They were able to look at their entire data set. It was something that they were not able to do using, like an Oracle database and using other technologies. And it wasn't until Incorta that they're able to leverage that, which in result increased the amount of revenue that they could realize from, something as simple as better enforcing accounting policy and rules on value cards and what they could recognize as revenue. So that was quite an interesting change. I think probably one of the other ones was, I talked a little bit about fixed asset depreciation. So we always thought of our platform as like an analytical platform, but in reality, when you think about it, what did we say we do really well? We do really complex queries very, very efficiently and fast. And then you couple it with something like a Python Spark platform. And then all of a sudden you can say, well, hey, we've got these really complex business processes. And so this was a social media company, has millions of assets, in its servers, and it needs to depreciate them. And that's a really complex process for running, and it takes a long time. So putting on Incorta, all of the queries that were needed to be run as part of that process was much, much faster. It increases their ability to close their books on time, to be able to close out the month quarter end. So we've seen a lot of use cases of that. So those kind of interesting when you start to see processing. Another one was a company that did their vacation accruals, figuring out exactly all of the rules that come into play, right, for vacation accrual. It can get very complex. So those are more like high intensity data processing that's been taken care of on the platform, versus than just thinking, how do I get a dashboard that shows, my spend in these various categories and things like that. So definitely seen some interesting creative ways in which people have come in. Probably the third one I would say is that right in the early days of COVID, there was a top 20 US bank that uses Incorta. And literally within 2 days, they created an entire COVID management set of dashboards that would track things like VPN access. Did employees have access? Were they able to log into VPN who were working from home? If people did come into an office location, how did they do, tracking and be able to do alert if someone has a COVID exposure? Having all of that information, training, being able to say, do we need to get people training? Do people need even hardware? Some people didn't have laptops, didn't have machines at home to work on. How do you get your entire organization to be, mobilized to work remote in a very, very short amount of time and manage and look at that? So a project like that, looking at even COVID cases and intensity, so bringing in external data sets in as well and overlaying all of that became really, really fascinating to see just how quick they were able to turn on a dime and start to implement their COVID policies and procedures.
Modern data teams are dealing with a lot of complexity in their data pipelines and analytical code. Monitoring data quality, tracing incidents, and testing changes can be daunting and often takes hours to days or even weeks. By the time errors have made their way into production, it's often too late and the damage is done. Datafold built automated regression testing to help data and analytics engineers deal with data quality in their pull requests. Datafold shows how a change in SQL code affects your data, both on a statistical level and down to individual rows and values before it gets merged to production. No more shipping and praying. You can now know exactly what will change in your database. Datafold integrates with all major data warehouses, as well as frameworks such as Airflow and dbt, and seamlessly plugs into CI workflows. Visit dataengineeringpodcast.com/Datafold today to book a demo with Datafold. In your own experience of building the Incorta platform and growing the business, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
Oh, there's been many. I think one that is kind of serendipitous. Like when we started Incorta, we thought tablets were going to take over the world. Like we thought everyone's going to be on like iPads and various things. So at this point, there was a lot of commentary out there that, they were going to take over MacBooks or laptops and everyone would be using these tablet devices. And so we started off by building our product 100% on tablet. So it was all cloud services behind, of course, like you were doing analytics on the tablet itself, but you were bringing in new data sets, you were doing everything on the tablet. And we thought this is empowering. This is the way people will want to work on the go, looking at it. And then we ended up, selling Incorta at a company that makes, very world famous tablets. And they were like, yeah, it's cool. We like it, but you know what? We're going to really need a desktop application. And so then we're kind of like, well, if the people who make these tablets really want a desktop application, maybe we really need to rethink whether we think it's going to be just on tablets. So we ended up implementing what we'd built in the tablet actually on the web. And so we built a web experience. We didn't build a client. We wanted it to be on the web. That time we built it. It was right before React had kind of taken off. So it was Angular. We built it in Angular. And it mimicked exactly our iPad experience. And so that actually became a real positive because if we had built from day one for a desktop experience, you can easily fall into the trap of making things complex. When you have a tablet being the forcing function, what ends up happening is you develop a very simplified way of doing tasks. And so we did that, and it actually worked out really well for us because it ended up being like, wow, okay, this is very efficient, this is very effective. People like the user experience because it didn't feel clunky and complicated and difficult, which is like, of course, because it was an iPad app or a tablet app, right? You can't make them ridiculously complex with lots of clicks and double clicks and things like that. You generally have to simplify that process. That was kind of a fortunate mistake, if you like, that ended up paying off really well. There's been other ones where we've looked at, before we landed on Parquet and Spark, we looked at various other things. There was a time where we looked at Drill, and we're looking at Drill queries, and ended up moving to Spark because it was more effective for that kind of processing. There's data formats, like do you want to go with ORC or do you want to go with Parquet? Benefits, cost of both, went with Parquet. There's a lot of things that kind of come along. It's like, okay, do you want to go with Delta Lake format or do you want to go with Iceberg table formats? So that's kind of one of the things we're looking at right now. And also we have Delta Lake format support, but looking at Iceberg as well and seeing like what are the options there, like where are things going. So there's a lot of definitely things that are moving and how to integrate with those and how to leverage those. We ended up moving off of Angular onto React, which is a project that took a bit of time for us to complete, but that has been, a very positive move as well, just in terms of developing the application. There's a lot of those things where we're constantly, spent the last 2 days on an offsite where just meeting with the team, just really taking a hard look at like, what do we have on our platform? What do we have because we had to have it and we had to have it because nothing was there, but what's going on right now that maybe we should be partnering with? Maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. Is there value to our customers? And is that what makes us unique? Just because you have a piece of functionality doesn't mean you should continue to have it. Sometimes it might be more effective to say, like, let's decommission that, let's use a different vendor or partner with a different company, and then let's put all of our focus into what makes us unique. So a big thing that we kind of keep going back to is, what is it that makes us very unique? And it always goes back to it. We can do analytics on the bronze, the raw ingest, the digital duplicate data, the 3NF data, like nobody else. That is what we're all about. Yes, we have connectors. Yes, we can create Parquet and Delta Lake format. Yes, we have all those things. But that's the core reason why people get excited, because they're like, well, that's a game changer. That changes the paradigm. That's not just you're a better version of something. So that's where I'm always trying to focus the team, is like, let's not just build things because there's an opportunity, but really build things because that's what we do really well. That's where our IP is. That's what makes us unique and different. And yeah, it's starting to see that message is starting to get traction. You know that when other vendors start to say things that people say, hey, they're starting to sound a little by what you've been saying for the last 4 or 5 years. It's quite rewarding in some respects, I guess, because you're like, okay, that means there is that mind shift, which needs to happen first. So when people make that shift, then they're like, well, okay, now I want to do analytics on my raw data without having to have expensive data pipeline ETL processing. Now it becomes a question of, well, who does that best? That's great. That, take that conversation every single day. Happy to have that. And so it's interesting to see that mind shift and start to take place where people are beginning to question things like the star schema model. We've been running a set of webinars called Death of the Star Schema, and these things have just been off the hook. The amount of people that show up that are interested in this topic and figuring out what exactly is going on with dimensional modeling and how we change this. And that speaks to really not our product directly. It speaks to the shift, the change, the desire to do something different. It's a very hot topic right now.
And for people who do want to accelerate their analytical capabilities and the speed at which they are able to do discovery, what are the cases where Incorta is the wrong choice?
As I mentioned, right, where we have focused and where we kind of have spent our time is around the application data. So it is those 3NF data sets. I think it's not the right choice if you were to come to me and say, hey, I've got IoT data that I want to, go and analyze, or I've got log files that are coming off of my servers that I want to look into and figure out what to do. There's different solutions that are geared towards that. So if your data is largely flat, so maybe it's like a use case of, in the semiconductor, they have a lot of data that comes in for every batch of wafers that they produce that looks for different parameters, thresholds, tolerances. And these things can be like 8 to 10,000 columns wide, those tables. And while Incorta supports that, you can have like masses of data being generated, but it's super fat, wide tables where all the data is contained within it. And you're trying to look for anomalies. Right. So that's where it becomes like there's different platforms. You'd look for, a massive MPP solution that was just like, okay, let's get, a solution to address that. That's where I'd say, you wouldn't use Incorta. Incorta can integrate with those. The majority of that workload would be on something else. But yeah, definitely the output of that could feed into something. The data from those could then be persisted into Parquet, and then Incorta picks that up and joins it with other bits of data as well. So that's kind of the beauty of what I think is happening in the industry, is that I think Parquet or cloud storage like S3 buckets are really going to replace what we've seen in the past. So in the past, if you wanted data from Marketo or you want data from Salesforce, the way you do it is they create a public API, right? SOAP API, whatever, REST API, and you go in and you end up, pulling data from those APIs. They manage them, they maintain them, and then you have to create these connectors and then bring them out. What I see happening, what I think is going, if I was building an application, let's say like a Zendesk or something like that today, and I say my customers want access to their data, which is obviously super common right now. I wouldn't go, I'm going to create a bunch of data APIs to do that. I would say, okay, I'm going to get a product, maybe does data replication that will land that data in Parquet in an S3 bucket, in AWS or whatever they want, and they pay for that. And so you just get that replication done and the vendor provides it. And instead of me having to create and support all of these, it can just plug something in probably in like a few weeks and then release that feature and then start charging for it. So I've been buying some products recently to use it in Incorta, and that has been the thing. It's like, oh, I need the data connector. And they say, well, we have an S3 bucket that you turn on and then you can read the data from that. So as you think about that transport data layer or the interface layer now becoming that format, now it becomes interesting because it's like, okay, I have all these different applications coming together. Who can read that data and sit on top of that data and integrate with that data? So being able to read directly from that Parquet data and then provide value on top of it and use different solutions for different parts of it becomes, I think, very interesting. So I think that's some of the changes that are taking place in the way that people think about how they access data.
And as you continue to build and evolve the Incorta platform, what are some of the things that you have planned for the near to medium term, or any problem areas that you're excited to dig into?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I always keep asking is like, because we do analytics without changing the shape of the data, what is it that we can do so well that other people struggle? And so one of the things has been that we can build applications, data applications on top of the data model, and it can apply to every customer. So we have, as I mentioned, like Shutterfly or this coffee chain or the social media companies or the media streaming companies. They all use our same data application. That is largely unheard of because they have very different ways of looking at the data. And traditionally, before Incorta, they would have had very different data warehouses. They would have looked very different. And it would be very difficult just to create one that size fits all. Even though they start with the same product, they start with the same application. So we've invested a lot in creating an ecosystem around that. So we refer to that as data applications, where we provide these quick start ways for people to deploy them and start leveraging them, whether it's NetSuite, EBS, Cloud ERP, SAP, et cetera, et cetera. But what we're working around now is how do we create a framework where there's more of a marketplace where people can collaborate. So a big thing for us is how to create more opportunities for collaboration. So one of the things we did recently is we released our component SDK, which is a React-based SDK that people can build any visualization and deploy it into the Incorta environment. And then they can use our analyzer, which is our builder, to be able to build and put things and build dashboards using those components. So what it was meant is a guy on my team was able to take that component SDK, grab like an eChart, Apache eChart, and be able to bring that across, import the project, and connect it and deploy it in an Incorta environment. So now you can start to think about, we can create very creative, purpose-built data applications that almost feel like video games in the sense of we can really build for the specific use case. When you look at dashboards in general, what I've seen happen a lot is that every dashboard kind of looks the same, but the data might be radically different. So it might be a different area of the business, but it'll have like, oh, there's a scatter plot, there's a column bar here, there's various things. Very few times where you look at it and go, oh, that's obviously a sales dashboard, or that's obviously a returns dashboard, or purchasing dashboard, collections dashboard. But we can start now to build that kind of those things together. Now, when we start to get that momentum moving as well, you can then overlay this whole idea of understanding how people interact with data. Because the data didn't go through a black box, because the structure is the same, if any one of the customers are interacting with an object, now we're able to say, because that data lineage is very clear, we can say, oh, you're interested in this column. People like you are also interested in this other column when they picked that one. Or when they did a group by on this dimension, 95% of the time they filter by this. So I think there's, how do we bring the metadata knowledge of how people want to interact with data and bring that into this so they can start to like help people understand, versus just looking at what does the data seem to say that's interesting. So that's kind of been the vantage point that a lot of other companies are taking, is how do I surface interesting things in the data? I think that goes to a certain degree, but I think that misses out the human element. Like, what are people looking at and engaging with it and tying that back? Because that becomes very interesting, because at the end of the day, we build analytics for people generally, there are some closed loop systems that will automatically do something that kind of take that as a different use case. For this one, it's like, how do we gauge what's informative, useful for people and kind of bring that to the surface? So I think there's some interesting work around that. There's nothing that is a standard around how to create these data applications in the industry. So we're looking at how do we create that? How do we create a marketplace where you can deploy a Tableau workbook on top of maybe an Incorta data set that helps you look at collections that maybe have been built by a vendor for a specific, industry use case that kind of helps elevate, their analytical solutions. So I think there's interesting ways in which how do we leverage the community and the people at large in terms of the questions they ask and what's of interest to them versus just the technology for the sake of being interested in technology.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
Of course, one of the things we've been talking extensively today is the need to get access to all of the data, right? So I think one of the things that's been very limited in the industry at large has been most analytics are on a massively, subset of the data, whether that's just a subset of the columns that are available. They're not getting access to everything. So that's been a fundamental challenge for people that I think is really not helping what the business needs access to. I think the other thing is when we think about the data formats, right? So we've seen some great movement in terms of Parquet. Parquet is columnar format. And you think about that table formats as well, which I think has been great in terms of the work that's been done there. But I would say Parquet, even though it's new, it's showing its age in a little bit, because you could think about Parquet as a format that actually it has columnar in it, but there's also a play where you could say sometimes some of the data, it's actually best for you to have it in a record written approach where it's not columnar. And so I think we need to start to see more of this hybrid within the files themselves, because at certain points you need to read all of the rows. And so you might be like, I need to read everything in this area, but then certain times you need to see it as columnar. So I think Parquet potentially could see some changes in that space. I think that would be an area that would be great to move kind of that forward. And then I think on the other aspects, just in terms of the data lineage, the data understanding, semantic layer, there's a lot of things out there. I think in terms of how people define those and get those in one place for their entire organization, regardless of whether it's data science or data analytics, I think that's a key piece that people seem to be missing. Sometimes they focus on just one piece of the puzzle. They might focus on, cloud data warehouse, so kind of go from that and say that's the standard, and then kind of miss out on some of these integration points, which are really going to be important, because at the end of the day, you need that abstraction between what people are building and where the things are stored. Otherwise, you end up with like vendor lock-in, you end up with a lot of things. I think there's some great movement in this area to kind of expose, may the best technology win, and it may not be because you're locked into data formats, you're locked into one way of being able to access the data. I think some of those openings there will be interesting to see. And then when that happens, I think the area or the gap that you start to see is, well, when I've got multiple solutions that I can look at for this, and you've got like an Incorta platform that's really good on 3NF, and you've got Presto that can do a phenomenal job on, large volume data, and Splunk or a graph database for something else, then how do you orchestrate between that, the SQL orchestration between those environments and sets of the controls between them? How can you ensure that you're setting the right workload to the right engine? So you might have a query that says, I could run this against Presto and it'll take 2 hours. I could run this against Incorta and it'll take like 5 seconds. Or it could be, I could run this against Incorta and it won't be effective to run there at all. But if I run this against Presto, it will be. Having that capability where we think about using these underlying technologies in a seamless way that users don't have to worry about it. They just build on data. And then the workload gets routed to the most appropriate engine. Because we make a lot of decisions in these products when we build them, right? We're building for a specific use case. We're testing on certain data. Like in our case, we're using high volume 3NF data. Our early customers had huge volumes of data in 3NF that a lot of people don't get access to. If I go online and search for 3NF data, it's really hard to find sample data sets that are real world at scale. You won't find them. Whereas if you're building something like when they were building Presto, they were using a very different data set as what they were optimizing for. So you make a lot of decisions to optimize when you build a product for the use case that's in front of you. And lots of these systems all had different use cases in front of them. But I think it's going to be interesting just to see, you plug in quantum computing into that as well. And it's like, okay, how do we create an ecosystem where you've got all of these things at your disposal and we're putting the right workloads on the right technologies at the end of the day?
Yeah, definitely a complex and interesting question to ponder. So thank you for sharing those thoughts on that. And thank you for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing at Incorta. It's definitely a very interesting product and an interesting problem space. And I appreciate all of the time and energy that you and your team have put into making it easier for teams to be able to gain useful insights from all of their source data. So thank you again for all of that. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tobias. It was great being here.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.